I'm going to continue my journey in the world of Hytale. I want to tell you guys that this game is really good and very well made. I'm enjoying the experience of playing it a lot. While I explore this gigantic world, I'll be telling you the best stories I found on Reddit this week. Let's move on to the first story. My boyfriend pauses. Our relationship. Whenever life gets hard. At first, I told myself it was mature of him. Whenever things got stressful, work deadlines, family drama, money anxiety, he would sit me down, voice calm, eyes tired, and say some version of, "I need to pause us for a bit. I can't be a good partner right now." He always framed it like self-awareness, like he was protecting both of us from unnecessary damage. No yelling, no insults, just a temporary emotional freeze. The first time it happened, I was confused but sympathetic. Everyone needs space sometimes, right? We'd been together about 8 months then. He worked in tech, long hours, constant pressure. I told myself this was just how emotionally responsible adults handled stress. The pause lasted 2 weeks. We didn't fight. We didn't talk much either. When he came back, he was affectionate, attentive, apologetic. He thanked me for being understanding. I felt proud of myself for being supportive. The second time, it hurt more. That pause came after I asked for something small. More consistency with plans, fewer last-minute cancellations. He looked overwhelmed immediately. 2 days later, he told me he needed space again. This time, I cried. He hugged me and said, "This is exactly why I need the pause. I can't handle emotional pressure right now." That sentence stuck with me. Emotional pressure. As if my feelings were a burden instead of part of a relationship. The pauses became a pattern. Every time life got hard for him, our relationship became optional. Bills piling up? Pause. Conflict at work? Pause. His parents fighting again? Pause. And every time I was expected to wait quietly, loyally, without needs, questions, or expectations. But here's the part I didn't tell anyone at first. During these pauses, he didn't act single in the obvious ways. But he didn't act partnered either. He went out more. He posted more. He laughed freely with friends. Meanwhile, I was stuck in emotional limbo, unsure if I was allowed to miss him, to be hurt, to feel abandoned. Once, during a pause, I ran into him at a bar with coworkers. He smiled when he saw me, hugged me, introduced me as a friend. I laughed it off in the moment. Then I cried in my car for half an hour. When I tried to talk about how these pauses made me feel, he always had an answer ready. "I'm just being honest. Would you rather I stay and resent you? I need someone who understands my coping mechanisms." Somewhere along the way, I started believing that loving him meant minimizing myself. I stopped bringing up concerns. I stopped asking questions. I pre-edited my emotions before speaking, filtering out anything that might overwhelm him. I became proud of how low maintenance I was becoming, how little I needed. But my body knew the truth before my mind caught up. I was anxious all the time. My stomach dropped whenever he seemed stressed. I felt like I was constantly bracing for the next pause. Love started to feel conditional, like access to him depended on my silence. The breaking point came after a particularly good month. No pauses, no distance. I started to relax again, to feel safe. Then, one night, over dinner, he casually said, "Work's about to get insane, so I might need to step back from us for a bit." Something in me snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just asked, "Do you ever plan on staying when things are hard?" He looked genuinely confused. That was my answer. I realized then that he didn't see these pauses as temporary survival strategies. To him, this was the relationship model. I was a comfort he could put on hold, not a partner he faced life with. Leaving wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, painful, clarifying. I told him I didn't want a love that disappeared when I needed it most. He said he understood, but also said he wasn't built for constant emotional availability. For the first time, I didn't try to make myself smaller to fit someone else's limits. Advice to the protagonist. Counseling, 500, 600 characters. You deserve a relationship that doesn't go on standby when life gets uncomfortable. Taking space can be healthy, but love that repeatedly disappears teaches your nervous system to stay anxious and guarded. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. If someone can only be present when things are easy, they are not offering partnership. They're offering convenience. Choosing yourself isn't abandoning love. It's refusing to abandon your own emotional safety. I found out my best friend has been trash-talking me in the group chat. It started with a stupid, harmless thing. My phone died. My best friend, Kelsey, had been asking me to send her the address for a small get-together we were going to that night. I told her I'd text it in a second. Then my phone dropped to 1%, shut off, and I didn't think much of it because I was already running around getting ready. When I finally got it charging and turned it back on, I had a handful of notifications, mostly missed calls from Kelsey and a couple texts from people in our friend group asking if I was still coming. No big deal. I replied, apologized, and moved on. Except, the weirdness didn't move on. At the get-together, the vibe felt off in a way I couldn't fully explain. People were polite, but it was like I'd walked into a room where everyone had already had a conversation without me. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Side glances. A few half-laughs that stopped when I looked up. Kelsey was acting normal, maybe even extra normal. She was louder, funnier, more attentive. The kind of attentive that feels slightly forced, like someone trying to prove something. I convinced myself I was imagining it. I've always been sensitive to shifts in energy, and sometimes my anxiety makes me overinterpret things. So I focused on being present and not spiraling. Then, near the end of the night, Kelsey went to the bathroom and left her phone on the couch. It lit up with a notification, a group chat, a name I recognized. It was the main friend group chat we all used for weekend plans, memes, gossip, everything. The preview of the message said, "I swear she does that on purpose so everything has to revolve around her." My throat went dry. I shouldn't have looked. I know that. I didn't pick up her phone and start scrolling because I thought I'd find drama. I looked because it felt like a car crash happening in slow motion, and my brain couldn't stop myself. I tapped the notification, and there it was, a thread of messages, newer ones, older ones, and some that clearly had a history. They weren't just about my phone dying. They were about me, my personality, my habits, the way I talk, the way I dress, the way I laugh, the way I sometimes make things about me, according to them. And Kelsey was the loudest one. She wasn't defending me. She wasn't clarifying. She wasn't even staying neutral. She was piling on. She's always like that. She needs so much validation. Honestly, I'm getting tired of it. She's not a bad person, but she's exhausting. Then, one message from her hit me like someone punched the air out of my lungs. I love her, but I have to manage her like a toddler sometimes. I read it 3 times, hoping it would change. It didn't. My hands started shaking. My face went hot and cold at the same time. I looked around the room, and suddenly every smile felt fake. Every laugh felt staged. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rewind time to 10 minutes earlier when I still thought Kelsey was safe. I closed the phone and put it back where it was. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. The rest of that night, I felt like I was acting in a play without the script. I watched Kelsey come back, sit next to me, lean into my shoulder, and ask if I wanted to grab brunch the next day like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just called me a toddler to our entire social circle. On the drive home, I cried so hard my chest hurt. But the worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was the betrayal. Because Kelsey wasn't just a friend. She was my person. The one who knew my family stuff. The one who knew about my insecurities. The one who knew where my soft spots were. And she was using that knowledge like ammo. The next morning, I confronted her. I didn't come in aggressive. I didn't even want to fight. I just wanted to hear anything that made it make sense. At first, she denied it. Then, when I told her I'd seen the chat, her face changed. Like annoyance flashed for half a second before she forced her expression back into something soft. She sighed and said, "Okay, but you weren't supposed to see that. Not, I'm sorry. Not, that was wrong. Just, you weren't supposed to see it." Then she did the thing that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. She turned it into my fault. You kind of put people in a position where they have to vent. We're allowed to have feelings. You can be a lot sometimes. It's not like we hate you. You're making this bigger than it is. And the more she spoke, the more I realized she wasn't embarrassed because she hurt me. She was embarrassed because she got caught. After that, the group chat became a shadow hanging over everything. If someone laughed a little too hard at something I said, I wondered if they were laughing at me. If someone didn't respond to my text right away, I pictured them typing about me somewhere else. I stopped posting, stopped reaching out, stopped initiating plans. I tried to be less, to take up less space, to give them fewer reasons. But you can't shrink yourself into being respected. All you do is disappear. Eventually, someone from the group asked why I'd been distant. I almost lied. I almost said I was busy. I almost protected Kelsey the way I always had. And then I realized I was still trying to be loyal to someone who had already stopped being loyal to me. So I told the truth, calmly, without drama. I said I had seen the group chat, and it changed how safe I felt around everyone. It was like dropping a rock into a still pond. Some people apologized immediately. Some said they didn't mean it that way. Some said they were just joking. 2 people never replied at all. Kelsey told everyone I invaded her privacy and made herself the victim. And that was the final confirmation I needed. Because when someone hurts you and then focuses on how your reaction inconveniences them, you're not dealing with a misunderstanding. You're dealing with a character reveal. Advice to the protagonist. Counseling. 500, 600 characters. Being talked about behind your back, especially by someone you trusted, creates a deep kind of insecurity that doesn't heal through pretending it didn't happen. You're not wrong for feeling betrayed. Notice who takes accountability versus who shifts blame or plays victim. Real friends don't manage you, they communicate with you. Protect your peace by choosing relationships where honesty isn't a group activity behind your back, but a conversation to your face. He loved that I was low maintenance, until I needed something. When we first started dating, one of the things he complimented most about me was how easy I was. He said it early, casually, like it was the highest praise he could offer. "I love that you're low maintenance," he told me after our 3rd date, smiling like he'd just discovered a rare personality trait. At the time, I took it as a good thing. I'd grown up watching relationships explode over jealousy, demands, constant arguments. Being easy felt mature, healthy, desirable. I didn't ask for much. I was flexible with plans, understanding when he was busy, relaxed about last-minute changes. If he canceled, I said it was fine and meant it, or at least I told myself I did. If he forgot to text back for hours, I assumed he was tired or distracted. I didn't double text. I didn't question his tone. I didn't ask where things were going. I told myself I was confident, secure, chill, and he loved that version of me. He would joke about it with his friends, right in front of me. "She's not like other girls," he'd say, laughing. "She doesn't get mad about dumb stuff." I smiled every time, even when something in my chest tightened. I didn't want to be the kind of girl who proved him wrong. Over time, though, I started to notice how one-sided that praise was. Being low maintenance didn't mean we both showed up with ease. It meant I did the adjusting. I was the one who bent, softened, accommodated. If I was upset, I waited until I wasn't. If I needed reassurance, I talked myself out of it. If something bothered me, I asked whether it was really worth bringing up. The first time I did bring something up, it surprised both of us. We'd been dating almost a year when I told him I felt a little disconnected lately. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I didn't raise my voice. I just said I missed feeling prioritized sometimes. He went quiet, then sighed, rubbing his face like I'd just handed him a complicated problem he didn't want to solve. "I thought you weren't like this," he said. "I thought you were low maintenance." The way he said it felt like a warning. After that, every need I expressed was treated like a deviation from the agreement I didn't remember signing. If I asked for more consistency, he said I was overthinking. If I wanted to talk about the future, he said I was putting pressure on him. If I got emotional, he'd remind me how much he appreciated that I was usually so chill, as if my feelings were an exception he tolerated rather than something he cared about. Slowly, I started editing myself again, but now it wasn't confidence driving it. It was fear. Fear of becoming too much. Fear of losing the version of me he loved. Fear that needing anything would cost me everything. What I didn't realize at first was how much this dynamic was changing the way I saw myself. I started measuring my worth by how little I asked for. I felt proud when I swallowed disappointment. I told myself I was strong for handling things alone. But there was a quiet resentment building underneath it all, one I didn't know what to do with. The moment everything shifted wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost insignificant. I'd had a rough week, work stress, family stuff, the kind of emotional exhaustion that makes you feel hollow. I told him I was struggling and could really use some extra support. He listened, nodded, then said, "I'm just not in a place to deal with heavy emotions right now." I remember staring at him, suddenly seeing the full picture. He didn't love that I was low maintenance. He loved that I didn't require him to stretch. In that moment, I understood something that hurt more than the relationship itself. I had been performing emotional independence, not living it. I wasn't choosing ease for myself. I was choosing it for him. And the second my humanity showed up, the role I'd been playing no longer worked. Ending things felt strange, almost unjustified on the surface. He didn't cheat. He wasn't cruel. But love that only exists when you're convenient isn't love that can hold you when life gets real. I walked away, feeling both heartbroken and lighter, like I was finally allowed to take up space again. Now, when someone calls me low maintenance, I pay attention to what they mean, because being easygoing is a personality trait, but being emotionally silent is a survival strategy, and I'm not interested in confusing the two anymore. Advice to the protagonist. Counseling, 500, 600 characters. You're not asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to earn love by minimizing your needs. Being low maintenance should mean peace, not self-erasure. Pay attention to how someone responds when you need support, not when you're convenient. The right partner won't be threatened by your emotions. They'll make room for them. You deserve a love where showing up fully doesn't feel like a risk. My family started treating my success like a group project. I used to think the hardest part would be getting out. Growing up, money was always tight. The kind of tight that lives quietly in the background of everything you do. Bills were discussed in hushed voices, vacations were something other families took, and stability felt like a luxury reserved for people who were born into it. I learned early how to be careful, how to not ask for too much, how to shrink my wants so they wouldn't feel embarrassing. When I finally decided I wanted more, it wasn't out of greed, it was out of exhaustion. I didn't want to be rich, I just wanted to breathe. I worked relentlessly. Community college, then a transfer, then a job that barely paid rent, then another that paid a little better. I said no to nights out, yes to overtime, and carried the quiet belief that if I just kept going, something would eventually give. When it finally did, it felt surreal. A solid job, real benefits, a paycheck that didn't disappear the moment it arrived. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for disaster. At first, my family was proud. They told people about me. They said things like, "She made it," and "We always knew she would." I loved hearing it, even though part of me felt uncomfortable being put on a pedestal I wasn't sure I deserved. But that pride didn't last very long. It slowly turned into expectation, and then into entitlement. It started small, a casual request to help cover a bill, a joke about how I was the rich one now. I didn't mind at first. I helped when I could, told myself this was what family did, but the requests kept coming, and the tone shifted. It was no longer gratitude, it was assumption. If I hesitated, I was reminded of where I came from. If I said no, I was told I'd changed. Every boundary I tried to set was met with disappointment. If I bought something nice for myself, I was accused of showing off. If I traveled, I was asked why I had money for that, but not for helping more. When I explained that I was saving, planning, trying to build something stable, I was told I was being selfish, that money had gone to my head. It felt like the only acceptable version of success was one that remained accessible to everyone else. The hardest part wasn't the money itself, it was the emotional weight attached to it. I felt like I was constantly being tested. If I helped, it became the new baseline. If I didn't, I was cold. There was no room for nuance, no space to just exist as someone who worked hard and wanted to protect what they'd built. I started to dread family gatherings, knowing someone would bring up finances, even indirectly, jokes that weren't really jokes, comments that lingered longer than they should have. I noticed how often I apologized for things that weren't wrong. I apologized for saying no. I apologized for needing time to think. I apologized for being tired. Somewhere along the way, I internalized the idea that my comfort came at the cost of someone else's resentment, and that I was supposed to accept that as the price of doing well. The moment everything came into focus was during a conversation with a relative who told me, flat out, that I owed the family for everything they'd done for me, not emotionally, financially, as if my success wasn't something I had fought for, but something that belonged to everyone now that it existed. I realized then that no amount of explaining would make them see me as an individual again. To them, I had become a resource. I still love my family. That hasn't changed. But loving them doesn't mean sacrificing my future to ease their discomfort with my present. I didn't work this hard just to end up feeling guilty for finally being okay. Learning that has been painful, lonely, and deeply clarifying all at once. Advice to the protagonist. Counseling, 500, 600 characters. Your success doesn't obligate you to carry everyone else. Helping out of choice is generous. Helping out of guilt is unsustainable. It's okay to love your family and still protect the life you worked for. Boundaries don't erase gratitude or loyalty. They preserve them. Pay attention to who respects your no as much as your yes. You're allowed to build stability without apologizing for it, and you're not responsible for fixing what existed before you had the power to change your own path. He started monitoring my mood, so we wouldn't fight. At first, I thought it meant he cared. He would watch my face closely when I walked into a room, ask if I was okay before I even said hello, adjust his tone depending on whether I seemed tired or distracted. He framed it as attentiveness, as emotional intelligence. "I'm just trying to read the room," he'd say. "I don't want us to fight." I had dated men who ignored my feelings entirely, so this felt like an upgrade. I told myself this was what a considerate partner looked like, but slowly, something shifted. His awareness stopped feeling like care and started feeling like surveillance. If I was quieter than usual, he'd ask what was wrong. If I said nothing, he'd push. If I insisted I was fine, he'd get tense, like I was withholding something important from him. If I admitted I was stressed, his mood would immediately change. He'd become guarded, cautious, distant, like my emotions were a warning sign he needed to manage. I began to notice how quickly my internal state became the center of the room, not because he wanted to support me, but because he wanted to prevent discomfort. Over time, I learned that certain emotions made him anxious. Frustration, sadness, fatigue, anything that hinted at conflict, even if I wasn't directing it at him. So, I started filtering myself. I smiled when I didn't feel like it. I softened my words. I delayed conversations until I could present them calmly enough not to trigger his defenses. I wasn't lying exactly, but I wasn't being honest either. I was curating my emotional expression for his comfort. He began narrating my moods out loud. "You seem off today. You look like you're about to get upset. I can tell this is going to turn into an argument." Often, he said these things before I felt anything at all. Sometimes his predictions created the very tension he claimed to be avoiding. I would start the day neutral and end it defensive, confused about how I'd gotten there. When I tried to explain how this made me feel, he insisted I was misunderstanding him. He said he grew up in a volatile household and learned to anticipate emotional shifts to stay safe. He said he was trying to be proactive, not controlling. I believed him because his explanation made sense. Trauma often does. But understanding the origin of a behavior didn't make living with it any easier. The dynamic started to change how I related to myself. I became hyper-aware of my own reactions, constantly asking whether they were reasonable, whether they were necessary, whether they would cause tension. I stopped trusting my emotional instincts and started treating them like potential problems to be solved. I felt responsible not just for my feelings, but for his peace. The breaking point came during an ordinary moment. I'd had a long day at work, nothing dramatic, just mentally draining. I came home quieter than usual, dropped my bag, and sat on the couch. He looked at me for a second and said, "Okay, what's wrong?" I told him I was just tired. He sighed and replied, "Can we not do this tonight? I don't have the energy for another thing." Something inside me cracked open. I realized I hadn't even expressed a complaint. I hadn't raised an issue. I had simply existed with a neutral expression, and that alone had been interpreted as a threat. In that moment, it became clear that he didn't want emotional honesty. He wanted emotional predictability. He wanted harmony, but only if it came from my restraint. I started to see how unsafe that made the relationship. Not in an explosive way, but in a quiet, corrosive one. There was no room for organic emotion, no space for bad days that didn't need fixing. Love had turned into emotional risk management, and I was the variable being controlled. Leaving was harder than I expected, because he truly believed he was doing the right thing. He told me he was just trying to keep us stable, that relationships shouldn't be constant emotional roller coasters. I agreed with him on principle, but I also knew this. Stability that requires silence isn't stability at all. It's suppression. Walking away meant relearning how to feel without apologizing. It meant trusting that my emotions didn't automatically equal conflict. It meant understanding that being seen isn't the same as being monitored, and that real safety comes from acceptance, not anticipation. Advice to the protagonist. Counseling, 500 to 600 characters. Being emotionally aware is not the same as being emotionally controlling. When someone treats your feelings like warning signs instead of valid experiences, you start shrinking without noticing. You're allowed to have off days, complex emotions, and imperfect reactions. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to manage yourself to keep someone calm. Pay attention to whether your partner creates space for your feelings or subtly trains you to hide them. Emotional safety means you can exist as you are, not just when you're easy to handle. I realized my partner was competing with me the whole time. I didn't notice it at first because it didn't look like competition. It looked like support. When I got accepted into a graduate program, he hugged me and told me how proud he was. When I landed a better job, he celebrated with me, posted about it online, told people I deserved it. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone who didn't feel threatened by my success, someone who seemed genuinely happy when good things happened to me. That belief lasted longer than it should have. The first crack appeared in small, almost invisible ways. Comments that sounded like jokes but landed a little too sharply. When I mentioned a compliment my boss had given me, he laughed and said, "Must be nice," in a tone that didn't quite match the words. When friends congratulated me, he'd add context I hadn't asked for, mentioning how stressful my job must be or how much pressure I was under, as if balancing the scales. I brushed it off. Everyone has off moments. Not everything needs to be dissected. But the pattern grew clearer with time. Whenever I talked about an achievement, he redirected the conversation to something he was working on, something he planned to do soon, something that would eventually put him back on equal footing. If I was excited, he became distant. If I was confident, he became critical. He never outright dismissed me, but he always found a way to subtly reframe things so my success didn't stand on its own. I started noticing how differently he reacted to my struggles versus my wins. When I was overwhelmed or doubting myself, he was attentive, patient, reassuring. He stepped in easily when I felt small, but when I felt capable, proud, grounded, something in him tightened. He'd withdraw, become irritable, find flaws in things that had never bothered him before. It was like my confidence disrupted the balance he was comfortable with. The realization hit me during a conversation that, on the surface, seemed harmless. I had just shared that I was being considered for a leadership role at work. Nothing was official yet, but it was exciting. He listened quietly, nodded, then said, "I just hope this doesn't change you." I asked what he meant, and he shrugged, saying he'd seen people get ambitious and lose perspective. The implication lingered between us, heavy and unspoken. That night, I lay awake replaying dozens of moments I'd dismissed. The way he compared our timelines. The way he framed my accomplishments as lucky breaks instead of earned milestones. The way he seemed most comfortable when I needed reassurance and least comfortable when I didn't. It dawned on me that he didn't just want to grow alongside me. He wanted to measure himself against me. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. His support had conditions. He was proud of me as long as my success didn't outpace his sense of self. I wasn't just his partner. I was his reference point. Every step I took forward forced him to confront where he felt stuck, and instead of dealing with that internally, he turned it into quiet rivalry. I tried to talk to him about it, choosing my words carefully, afraid of sounding accusatory. I told him I sometimes felt minimized when I shared good news, that it seemed like my wins made him uncomfortable. He laughed it off at first, calling me sensitive, saying I was projecting. When I persisted, his defensiveness surfaced. He said relationships weren't competitions, but his tone suggested that's exactly what this had been, even if he didn't want to admit it. The hardest part was recognizing how much I'd already adjusted myself to protect his ego. I'd started downplaying achievements, sharing less, celebrating privately. I caught myself softening my excitement before speaking, editing joy the same way people edit complaints. I didn't want to make him feel bad, and in doing so, I slowly erased parts of myself that had nothing to do with him. Eventually, I understood that this wasn't something encouragement or reassurance could fix. You can't love someone out of their insecurity if they're unwilling to face it. Staying meant continuing to shrink so he wouldn't feel small, and that wasn't a compromise I could keep making. Leaving forced me to confront a painful truth. Not everyone who claps for you is cheering. Some people are counting, some people are keeping score, and sometimes the quietest competition is the most damaging because it disguises itself as love until you realize you've been running a race you never agreed to be part of. Walking away didn't feel triumphant. It felt sobering, but it also felt like relief. For the first time in a long while, I could be proud of myself without wondering how it would land, without bracing for the subtle shift in energy that told me I'd gone too far. I wasn't ahead of anyone anymore. I was just moving forward, and that was finally enough. Everyone believed her stories, even when they cost me everything. I didn't realize how powerful a narrative could be until I watched mine get rewritten by someone else. It happened slowly, the way trust usually erodes, not with a single betrayal, but with a series of small moments that don't seem worth challenging until it's too late. We worked in the same social orbit at first, then the same professional one. She was charming in a disarming way, open about her struggles, quick to laugh at herself, generous with vulnerability. People liked her immediately. I did too. She told stories constantly about misunderstandings with friends, about being overlooked at work, about how often people disappointed her. The details were vivid, emotional, convincing. There was always a clear arc. She tried her best. Someone else failed her. She was left picking up the pieces. I listened, sympathized, offered support. It felt like the kind thing to do. It felt human. The first time I noticed something was off, it was so minor I almost dismissed it. A mutual friend asked me gently why I'd been so harsh with her during a meeting. I was confused. The meeting had been uneventful. I disagreed with a point she made, calmly, respectfully, the way disagreements happen in collaborative spaces. I laughed it off, assuming wires had crossed somewhere along the line. I didn't think to correct the record. Why would I? Surely the truth would speak for itself. It didn't. More comments followed, always indirect, always wrapped in concern. Someone asked if everything was okay between us. Another mentioned she'd been having a hard time because of workplace tension. I started to realize that whenever there was friction, her version arrived before mine, and her version always had a villain. I didn't see myself as that villain until I heard my own words come back to me, altered just enough to sting. Things I'd said thoughtfully were retold as cutting. Boundaries I'd set were reframed as coldness. Neutral actions were interpreted as personal slights. And each story was delivered with tears in her eyes, voice shaking, as if she were bravely admitting pain rather than quietly assigning blame. When I tried to address it with her, she looked genuinely hurt. She told me she never meant to paint me badly, that she was just processing out loud, that I was reading into things. She apologized in a way that felt sincere enough to make me question myself. I left those conversations feeling ashamed for bringing it up at all. That was when the isolation began. I noticed invitations slowing down, conversations stopping when I entered rooms, subtle shifts in tone that made me feel like I was intruding on something I used to belong to. I kept waiting for someone to ask me directly what was going on, to give me a chance to explain. No one did. They didn't need to. They already had a story that made sense. I started replaying interactions in my head, searching for proof that I was the problem. Maybe I was too blunt. Maybe I lacked empathy. Maybe I'd unknowingly hurt her more than I realized. The uncertainty gnawed at me. When you don't know what you're being accused of, you can't defend yourself. You can only shrink. The moment of clarity came when I overheard her telling a story I was actually present for. It wasn't just biased, it was false. Not dramatically, not outrageously, but in that careful, believable way that left just enough room for doubt. She described her intentions as pure, my actions as aggressive, the outcome as inevitable. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, but grief. The kind that comes when you realize you've been generous with someone who uses generosity as a weapon. I considered speaking up publicly, correcting every misrepresentation, reclaiming my name piece by piece. But I also understood something else then. I was already tired of explaining, tired of proving, tired of chasing a version of myself that only existed to counter someone else's narrative. Fighting it would mean staying entangled, staying reactive, staying small in a different way. So I chose distance instead. I stopped engaging beyond what was necessary. I focused on my work, my life, the people who knew me without needing translation. The absence was noticeable. A few people reached out, confused. Some didn't. She continued telling her stories, but without my proximity, they lost momentum. Drama needs an audience and a target, and I was no longer either. What surprised me most was how long it took to trust my own perception again. When you've been quietly villainized, you start questioning your reality. It takes time to rebuild the confidence that says, I know who I am, even if others don't. I learned that not every misunderstanding deserves correction, and not every accusation requires a response. Some people don't want resolution, they want roles. And once you're cast, the only way out is to leave the stage. I don't think she set out to destroy me. I think she needed to be the victim so badly that she didn't care who paid the price. That realization didn't make it hurt less, but it made it make sense. And sometimes, understanding is the closest thing to closure you get. I lost a community, yes, but I kept myself. And in the end, that mattered more than being believed by people who never asked to hear my side in the first place. He only praised me when I was halfway out the door. It took me a long time to notice the pattern, mostly because it disguised itself as hope. For most of our relationship, affection felt scarce, like something rationed. He wasn't cruel, not overtly. He didn't insult me or belittle me. He just moved through the days with a kind of emotional minimalism that left me constantly wondering where I stood. Compliments were rare. Gratitude was implied, not expressed. I told myself this was just his personality, that not everyone loved loudly, that consistency mattered more than words. But something strange would happen every time I reached my limit. The first time I pulled away emotionally, I didn't announce it. I was just tired. Tired of initiating conversations, tired of being the one to check in, tired of feeling invisible in a relationship that technically existed but didn't always feel alive. I became quieter, less available, less invested. And almost immediately, he noticed. Suddenly, he was attentive. He told me I looked beautiful in ways he hadn't mentioned in months. He sent long messages about how much I meant to him. He talked about the future with a certainty that felt new. It worked. I softened. I leaned back in. And just like that, the warmth faded. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Relationships have ups and downs. People get comfortable. Life gets busy. I didn't want to be the kind of person who kept score, but the pattern repeated itself too many times to ignore. Every time I expressed doubt, every time I hinted at leaving, every time my energy shifted from hopeful to distant, he transformed. He became the version of himself I'd been waiting for. And every time I stayed, that version disappeared. It was like affection only existed as a response to loss, never as a choice. I started to feel like I was being trained. Not intentionally, maybe, but effectively. I learned that my absence was more powerful than my presence, that my silence spoke louder than my words, that the only way to be seen was to be on the verge of leaving. It was a terrible realization, because it meant that stability would never be rewarded, only threat. What made it worse was how convincing he was during those moments. He didn't just say nice things, he sounded sincere. He reflected on our relationship, acknowledged his shortcomings, promised to do better. He made me believe that this time would be different, that something had clicked. And for a short while, it always felt like it had, until it didn't. Over time, I stopped trusting my own reactions. I wondered if I was asking for too much, if I was misinterpreting normal behavior, if my expectations were unrealistic. I compared us to other couples, told myself that at least he wasn't abusive, at least he stayed, at least he came back when it mattered. I minimized my loneliness because it didn't come with screaming or chaos. It came quietly, in the space between interactions, in the lack of reassurance, in the feeling of being tolerated rather than cherished. The breaking point wasn't a fight. It was a moment of clarity. I had just come back from a weekend away with friends, a trip I'd almost canceled because I didn't want to upset him. Being away reminded me of who I was outside of the relationship. I laughed easily. I felt light. I didn't second-guess every word. When I returned, he greeted me with unusual enthusiasm, compliments, affection, plans, and instead of feeling relieved, I felt tired, because I knew why it was happening. He sensed the distance. He felt the shift. And rather than show up consistently, he was pulling out the emergency version of love, the one designed to keep me from leaving, not to make me feel chosen. That was when I understood that the relationship wasn't failing because I wasn't patient enough or loving enough. It was failing because affection had become conditional. It depended on my willingness to stay uncertain. It thrived on imbalance. I didn't end things immediately. Realizations like that don't turn into action overnight. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every compliment felt reactive. Every promise felt strategic. I no longer wanted to be loved only when I was halfway out the door. I wanted a love that didn't need the threat of loss to show up. Leaving felt less like heartbreak and more like reclaiming something I'd misplaced. Not him, myself. My friend turned being broken into her whole identity. I met her at a time in my life when everything felt raw and unfinished, which is probably why our friendship formed so quickly. She was magnetic, in a quiet way, the kind of person who spoke openly about pain, who named her trauma without flinching, who made vulnerability feel like honesty instead of weakness. She talked about her anxiety, her past relationships, her childhood, all with the confidence of someone who had already survived the worst parts. I admired that. It made me feel less alone in my own mess. At first, our bond was built on long conversations that stretched late into the night. We talked about healing, about growth, about how self-awareness was supposed to set you free. She used language I recognized from therapy posts and mental health threads, words like triggers, boundaries, inner child. It felt like we were both moving towards something better, even if we didn't know exactly what that looked like yet. But slowly, something shifted. Every time the conversation turned toward change, real change, not just naming pain, she would shut down. If I mentioned therapy helping me set healthier boundaries, she would scoff and say therapy was just a way to make broken people functional for a broken system. If I talked about wanting more stability, she'd say stability was overrated and that suffering made you more real. At first, I thought she was just processing things differently. Healing isn't linear. People move at their own pace. But then I started noticing how invested she was in staying exactly where she was. Her trauma wasn't something she wanted to work through. It was something she performed. She told the same stories over and over, each time with sharper edges, as if the pain needed to stay fresh to remain valid. When something genuinely good happened in her life, a new opportunity, a healthy connection, she found a way to frame it as disappointing or threatening. Happiness made her suspicious. Peace bored her. What confused me most was how she reacted to my growth. When I started doing better, when I felt more grounded, she didn't celebrate it. She joked about it, calling me healed in a sarcastic tone, as if improvement were a betrayal. If I said I didn't have the energy for something, she accused me of becoming distant. If I set a boundary, she said I was abandoning her like everyone else. I began to feel like I had to choose between evolving and staying connected to her. The dynamic became exhausting. Every conversation circled back to her pain. My struggles were acknowledged briefly before being compared, measured, and overshadowed. If I expressed something difficult, she found a way to relate it back to herself in a way that felt less like empathy and more like competition. Whose trauma was worse? Who had suffered more? Who had the better reason to be dysfunctional? I started noticing how heavy I felt after spending time with her, not because pain is contagious, but because nothing ever moved forward. There was no curiosity about solutions, no space for accountability, no interest in imagining a life that wasn't defined by damage. Being broken had become her shield, her explanation, her excuse, and her personality. The moment everything crystallized was during a conversation where I gently suggested that she deserved support beyond venting, that maybe talking to someone professionally could help her feel less stuck. She laughed, not kindly, and said, "I don't want to be fixed. Being broken is the only thing that makes me interesting." She said it casually, like a joke, but it landed like truth. That was when I understood that this wasn't just fear of healing. It was attachment to identity. Pain had given her belonging, attention, language, community. Letting it go would mean facing who she was without it, and that felt more terrifying than staying miserable. I didn't cut her off dramatically. There was no explosive ending. I just started pulling back, slowly, intentionally. I stopped being her emotional dumping ground. I stopped responding to crisis texts that weren't actually crises. I stopped trying to convince her that she deserved more than survival mode. She noticed, of course. She accused me of changing, of becoming cold, of thinking I was better than her. For a moment, I almost believed her. Growth can look like betrayal to someone who needs you stuck beside them. But distance gave me clarity. I realized that friendship shouldn't require you to stay wounded so someone else doesn't feel alone. Compassion doesn't mean drowning together. You can care deeply about someone and still recognize that staying close is costing you your own well-being. I still hope she finds her way forward someday. I really do. But I also know that I don't have to sacrifice my healing to keep someone company in their pain. Some people aren't ready to let go of who they are in the dark, and you can't drag them into the light without losing yourself along the way. Walking away wasn't abandonment. It was acceptance. Acceptance that not everyone who understands your wounds wants to see them close, and that choosing growth sometimes means choosing a different path, even when it's lonely at first. He said he was bad with emotions, and I believed him for too long. He told me early on that he wasn't good with emotions, and I took that as honesty instead of a warning. He said it casually, almost apologetically, like it was a fixed trait, something baked into his personality that I'd need to accept if I wanted to be with him. At the time, it didn't scare me. I'd always believed people showed love in different ways, and I told myself that emotional fluency wasn't the same as emotional depth. Maybe he just expressed things differently. Maybe I could meet him halfway. What I didn't realize was that bad with emotions didn't mean awkward or inexperienced. It meant avoidant. Any conversation that required emotional presence felt like walking into fog. If I tried to talk about something that bothered me, he'd go quiet, then defensive. He'd say he didn't know what I wanted him to say, that he felt attacked, that he needed time to think. That time often stretched into days, during which the issue would dissolve simply because I no longer had the energy to hold it. When he came back, he'd act as if nothing had happened, relieved that the discomfort had passed, unaware, or unwilling to notice, that it had passed through me instead. I became the translator for both of us. I softened my words, framed my feelings as questions, minimized my reactions so they wouldn't overwhelm him. I'd rehearse conversations in my head, cutting out anything that sounded too emotional, too needy, too real. I learned which topics to avoid, which tones to use, which moments were safest to speak. I told myself this was compromise. Relationships take work, right? But the work wasn't shared. It was emotional labor performed quietly and constantly, without acknowledgement. Whenever I tried to explain how lonely that felt, he'd look genuinely confused. He'd say he showed love through actions, not words. He'd list things he did for me, rides, favors, practical help, as proof that he cared. And I believed him, even when it didn't fill the absence I felt. I started questioning whether I was asking for something unreasonable, whether my need for emotional connection was excessive, whether I should be grateful for what I was getting instead of focusing on what was missing. The imbalance became more obvious over time. He relied on me heavily when he was stressed, venting freely, unloading frustrations, expecting understanding without judgment. I listened, validated, reassured. But when the roles reversed, when I needed that same space, he shut down. He'd say he didn't know how to help, that emotions made him uncomfortable, that he felt helpless. Somehow, his discomfort always took priority over my pain. I began to feel like I was carrying the emotional weight of two people, holding space for his feelings while shrinking mine. I told myself that love meant patience, that if I just gave him enough time, he'd open up, that emotional safety would teach him what words couldn't. But safety only works when both people are willing to step into it. He wanted the benefits without the vulnerability. The moment that finally broke through my rationalizations was painfully ordinary. I had just lost someone important to me, and the grief sat heavy in my chest, making everything feel slower and duller. I didn't need solutions. I didn't need advice. I just needed presence. I told him that, clearly, directly. I asked if he could just sit with me for a bit. No fixing, no talking, just company. He sighed and said, "I'm really bad with this stuff. I don't want to make it worse." And then he left the room. I sat there alone, staring at the wall, realizing how often I'd been alone even when he was physically present, how often I'd accepted absence wrapped in explanation, how many times I'd excused neglect because it didn't come from malice. In that moment, it became clear that intention didn't change impact. Whether he meant to or not, I was being emotionally abandoned. When I finally ended things, he was shocked. He said he thought we were fine. He said he never knew it was that serious. He said he wished I'd said something sooner. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I had said something, over and over in 1,000 softened ways. He just hadn't been able, or willing, to hear it. Walking away felt like stepping out of a room where I'd been holding my breath for years. I didn't leave because he was bad with emotions. I left because I was tired of being the only one who made space for them. I learned that compatibility isn't just about love or effort or intention. It's about capacity. And no matter how much I cared, I couldn't keep building a bridge alone. Now, when someone tells me they're bad with emotions, I listen differently. Not with judgment, but with clarity. Because loving someone doesn't mean accepting a relationship where your inner world has no place to land. I slowly realized he was lying just to seem like someone else. At first, the lies were so small they barely registered as lies at all. They sounded more like exaggerations, harmless edits meant to make a story flow better. He'd talk about experiences from college, jobs he almost took, people he knew casually but described with confidence. None of it felt alarming. Everyone smooths the edges of their past a little, right? Especially early in a relationship, when you're still figuring out how to be seen. What made him appealing in the beginning was how put together he seemed. He always knew the right reference, the right opinion, the right anecdote. He spoke with certainty about things I assumed he'd lived through. I admired that confidence. It felt grounding to be with someone who seemed so sure of himself, so clear about who he was and where he'd been. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They surfaced quietly, in moments that felt easy to dismiss. A timeline that didn't quite line up. A story he told twice, slightly different each time. A mutual acquaintance who remembered an event in a way that contradicted his version. Each time, I told myself memory was unreliable, mine included. I didn't want to be suspicious of someone I cared about, but suspicion doesn't usually arrive loudly. It accumulates. I started noticing how often his stories positioned him just a little higher than reality might allow. He wasn't just part of something, he was central to it. He wasn't just present, he was pivotal. He talked about past relationships in ways that made him sound endlessly patient and misunderstood. Always the one who tried harder, loved deeper, gave more. Every conflict had a clear villain, and it was never him. The first lie I could no longer ignore came from something trivial. We were at a small gathering and someone asked about a certification he'd mentioned before. He answered smoothly, confidently, describing the process in detail. Later that night, alone with me, he admitted he never actually completed it. He laughed when he said it, like it was a quirky confession. "It just sounds better when I tell it that way," he said. I remember feeling unsettled, not because of the lie itself, but because of how easily it had come to him, how natural it seemed. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked relieved, like he'd been holding something light, not heavy. After that, I started listening differently. I noticed how often his stories changed depending on the audience. With friends, he emphasized ambition. With coworkers, competence. With strangers, charm. With me, vulnerability. Each version felt tailored, polished, just believable enough. It wasn't that any single story was outrageous. It was that there were too many versions of him, and none of them fully aligned. When I asked gentle questions, he'd deflect. When I pointed out inconsistencies, he'd say I was overanalyzing. Sometimes he'd accuse me of not trusting him. turning my curiosity into a flaw. I began doubting my instincts, wondering if I was being unfair, if I was expecting an unrealistic level of precision from someone who just liked storytelling. But then the lies stopped being harmless. He told people things about our relationship that weren't true, not dramatically false, but subtly skewed. He'd say I was hesitant when I was simply cautious, that I needed reassurance when I'd asked for clarity. He framed himself as endlessly accommodating, even when I knew how often I'd been the one compromising. Hearing my own experiences filtered through his narrative made me feel disoriented, like I was losing ownership of my own life. The worst part wasn't confronting him. It was realizing how much of the relationship was built on an image instead of a person. I wasn't in love with who he was. I was in love with who he wanted to be seen as. And the more comfortable he got, the more effort he put into maintaining that image, even if it meant bending the truth around the people closest to him. One night, after another story unraveled under gentle questioning, I asked him why he did it. Not angrily, not accusingly, just honestly. He went quiet for a long time before admitting that he hated feeling ordinary, that he felt invisible growing up, that being impressive felt safer than being real. His voice cracked when he said it, and for a moment, I felt deep compassion for him. But compassion didn't erase the damage. I realized I'd been slowly losing trust, not in dramatic leaps, but in tiny withdrawals. Each lie made it harder to relax, harder to believe, harder to feel grounded. I was constantly fact-checking in my head, constantly wondering which version of him I was getting. Love needs stability. It needs something solid to land on. And I was starting to feel like I was standing on shifting ground. Leaving wasn't about punishing him for lying. It was about choosing reality over illusion. I didn't want a partner who needed to be impressive at the cost of being honest. I wanted someone who could sit comfortably in who they were, even if that version wasn't remarkable to everyone else. When I walked away, he accused me of not accepting him fully. I didn't argue, because the truth was simpler and sadder than that. I had accepted him. I just couldn't accept a relationship where truth was optional and identity was a performance. It took time to stop second-guessing my perceptions after that, to trust that what I saw and heard mattered. But clarity eventually replaced confusion, and with it came a quiet relief. I no longer had to wonder which version of someone I was loving. I was finally back in a relationship with reality, and that, I learned, is the foundation everything else depends on. My family said therapy made me arrogant. I didn't announce therapy like a milestone. I didn't post about it or frame it as a breakthrough. I started going quietly, on Tuesday afternoons after work, sitting in traffic afterward with my thoughts louder than the radio. Therapy didn't turn me into a new person overnight. It just gave language to things I'd been carrying for years. It helped me notice patterns, especially the way I said yes when I meant no, the way I smoothed things over before they could even become conflicts, the way I absorbed discomfort so other people wouldn't have to. For the first time, I was learning to pause instead of react, to ask myself what I actually wanted before answering. That pause was what changed everything. At first, my family didn't notice. They were used to me being the reliable one, the agreeable one, the person who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. I was the one who mediated arguments, who remembered birthdays, who adjusted plans without fuss. Therapy didn't make me less loving, it made me more honest. And honesty, it turns out, is disruptive when people are invested in who you used to be. The first comment came after I declined a last-minute favor. Nothing dramatic, just a simple no. I explained that I was overwhelmed and needed a quiet night. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than anger. Someone laughed and said, "Wow, therapy really changed you." I smiled, unsure how to respond, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. From there, every boundary became a data point. If I left early, I was distant. If I didn't engage in a familiar argument, I was cold. If I explained how something made me feel, I was lecturing. They started using the word arrogant in a way that confused me, as if self-awareness had turned into superiority. I wasn't telling anyone what to do. I wasn't diagnosing them. I was just no longer bending myself into shapes that kept everyone else comfortable. The hardest part was how often they framed my growth as rejection. When I stopped oversharing, they said I was secretive. When I asked for space, they said I was pulling away. When I named a boundary, they said I was putting myself above the family. It felt like any move toward self-respect was interpreted as a move away from them, even when I was still there, still showing up, just differently. I tried explaining. I really did. I told them therapy wasn't about blaming anyone, that it was helping me understand myself better. I said I was learning how to communicate more clearly, not less. But explanations didn't land because they weren't looking for understanding. They were looking for familiarity. They wanted the old version of me back, the one who made everything smoother, even at her own expense. I began to notice how much emotional labor had been expected of me before I ever named it. How often I'd been the buffer, the translator, the peacekeeper. Therapy didn't create conflict. It revealed where it already existed. And once revealed, it couldn't be unseen. The tension I felt wasn't new. It was just no longer absorbed quietly. There were moments I doubted myself. When enough people tell you you've changed, you start wondering if you've changed for the worse. I asked my therapist whether I was becoming rigid, less compassionate. She asked me who benefited from the old version of me. The answer came too quickly to ignore. I realized that humility, in my family, had always meant compliance. That being easy meant being available. That love was measured by how much you could give without asking for anything back. Therapy hadn't made me arrogant. It had made me visible to myself. And visibility can feel like defiance to people who are used to you blending into the background. The shift didn't destroy my relationships, but it did clarify them. Some adjusted, some didn't. A few conversations ended awkwardly, unresolved, with a quiet understanding that things were different now. I mourned that. Growth comes with grief, especially when it costs you a version of belonging you didn't realize was conditional. What I know now is this. Therapy didn't give me an ego. It gave me a spine. It didn't teach me to look down on anyone. It taught me to stop looking past myself. And while I still love my family, I no longer confuse love with self-erasure. I can be connected without being consumed. I can be respectful without being silent. And if that looks like arrogance to people who benefited from my discomfort, then that's a misunderstanding I'm finally willing to live with. He thought apologizing was a weakness. He used to say it casually, almost like a principle he lived by. Apologies, according to him, were for people who lacked conviction. He believed that saying sorry gave away power, that it placed you beneath the other person, that it invited disrespect. The first time he said it, we were talking about something unrelated, a story about a disagreement he'd had with a coworker years earlier. He told it with pride, emphasizing how he'd stood his ground and never apologized, even when the tension lingered. I remember feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. Everyone has strange beliefs, I told myself. This was just one of his. At the beginning of our relationship, it didn't show up often. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't recognize it for what it was. When we argued, he didn't yell or insult me. He stayed calm, firm, controlled. He spoke like someone presenting a case, not someone trying to understand another person. If I cried, he grew more rigid, as if emotion itself proved his point. The conversations always ended the same way, unresolved, but quiet. He'd act normal afterward, as though the absence of an apology meant the absence of harm. I became the one who smoothed things over, not because I believed I was always wrong, but because I wanted peace. I learned how to phrase my feelings carefully, how to acknowledge his perspective first, how to soften my disappointment so it wouldn't sound like blame. Sometimes I apologized just to move forward, even when I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. He never stopped me. He never questioned it. He accepted my apologies easily, like they were expected. Over time, a pattern emerged that I couldn't ignore. Whenever something hurt me, the conversation shifted away from impact and toward intention. He didn't mean it that way. I misunderstood. I was being sensitive. And because he didn't see himself as wrong, there was nothing to apologize for. The burden of resolution fell quietly on me. If I wanted closeness again, I had to create it. If I wanted relief, I had to provide it. I started noticing how much space his certainty took up. There was no room for repair, only for endurance. Disagreements didn't lead to growth, they led to stalemates. He believed that if he stood firm long enough, the discomfort would pass. And it usually did, because I carried it away with me. I processed it alone, talked myself out of resentment, convinced myself that love meant understanding someone else's limits. But something shifted inside me. I felt it in my body before I could articulate it in words. A tightening in my chest during arguments, a hesitation before bringing things up, a growing sense that my feelings existed in a vacuum, acknowledged but never held. I didn't need grand gestures or dramatic remorse. I just needed to hear, "I'm sorry that hurt you." And yet, that sentence seemed impossible for him to say. The moment that broke the illusion was deceptively small. He made a joke in front of friends that embarrassed me. Nothing cruel, nothing explicit, just a comment that landed wrong and stayed there. Later, when I told him how it made me feel, he laughed it off. He said I was reading into it, that no one else thought it was a big deal. When I didn't drop it, he grew irritated. "I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do wrong," he said. "If you took it the wrong way, That's not on me. I remember sitting there, staring at him, realizing that this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about refusal. Refusal to acknowledge that love sometimes requires humility, that being wrong isn't the same as being weak, that repair is not surrender. In that moment, I saw the future clearly, a life where every conflict ended in emotional distance, where every wound healed without acknowledgement, where I slowly learned to stop expecting care where none was offered. I tried one last time to explain it to him, not as an accusation, but as a need. I told him that apologies weren't about blame, that they were about connection, about showing someone that their pain mattered, even if you hadn't intended it. He listened, arms crossed, expression unmoved. Then he said, "I just don't think that way." And that was the truth. Not just about apologies, but about us. Walking away wasn't dramatic. There was no final argument, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding that I couldn't build intimacy with someone who saw accountability as defeat. I realized that love without repair is fragile, that relationships don't survive on being right, but on being willing to soften, willing to meet someone in the space between intention and impact. Now, when I think back, I don't remember the arguments as much as I remember the silence afterward, the space where an apology should have lived. I learned that an unwillingness to say sorry isn't strength, it's distance. And distance, no matter how calm or controlled, is still a form of leaving. She started borrowing my pain, like it belonged to her. I didn't notice it the first time, because the first time felt like empathy. I told her something personal, something I rarely shared, about a period in my life when I'd been deeply anxious, barely functional, quietly unraveling while still showing up every day like nothing was wrong. She listened closely, eyes soft, nodding at the right moments, saying all the things you hope to hear when you finally let something heavy out of your chest. I remember feeling relieved afterward, lighter, grateful to have a friend who seemed to understand. A few weeks later, I heard my story come out of her mouth. We were with a group of people, laughing, talking about mental health in that casual, semi-serious way people do when they want to seem open without going too deep. Someone mentioned anxiety, and suddenly she jumped in, animated, expressive, telling a story that sounded familiar, too familiar. The details were slightly rearranged, but the core was unmistakable. The sleepless nights, the constant sense of dread, the way it crept into everyday life. She spoke in the first person. I told myself I was imagining it. Trauma overlaps, pain rhymes. Not everything belongs to one person. I didn't want to be possessive over suffering. That felt wrong. So I stayed quiet, but it didn't stop. Every time I shared something vulnerable with her, it reappeared later, repackaged as her own experience. Sometimes it happened quickly, sometimes weeks later, but the pattern was undeniable. If I talked about feeling invisible growing up, she'd later describe how no one ever really saw her. If I opened up about a difficult relationship with a parent, she'd soon tell a story about emotional neglect that mirrored mine almost exactly. The language changed, but the emotional blueprint stayed the same. What made it confusing was how sincere she seemed. She wasn't mocking me. She wasn't minimizing what I'd been through. In fact, she often told these stories with intense emotion, sometimes even more emotion than I'd shown myself. People responded to her with concern, with sympathy, with validation. They gathered around her, offered comfort, praised her strength. And I stood there, silent, watching my own experiences generate care for someone else. I started pulling back without fully realizing it. I shared less. I kept things lighter. I avoided going deep. But she noticed. She always noticed. She asked if I was okay, if I was pulling away, if she'd done something wrong. When I hesitated, she filled the space with her own pain, reminding me of how hard things were for her lately. The timing was uncanny. Any moment that might have centered me somehow curved back toward her. The tension came to a head during a conversation I hadn't planned to have. She was telling a group about a recent breakdown, using phrases I recognized because they were mine, words I'd used months earlier when I was still trying to understand my own experience. Something inside me tightened. After everyone left, I asked her about it, as gently as I could. I told her it felt strange hearing my story echoed back through her, that it made me uncomfortable. Her reaction wasn't defensive, it was wounded. She looked at me like I'd accused her of something cruel. She said she wasn't copying me, that she was just relating, that hearing my experiences had helped her articulate her own pain. She said I was invalidating her feelings, gatekeeping trauma, making it about myself. Her voice shook, tears appeared, and just like that, I was the one comforting her. That was the moment everything clicked. This wasn't about shared experience. It was about attention. My vulnerability wasn't something she held with care. It was something she absorbed, something she used to shape a version of herself that people responded to. My pain had become material, and the more I tried to protect it, the more she framed herself as hurt by my boundaries. After that, I stopped sharing anything personal with her, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The friendship changed. Without my stories to borrow from, her crises intensified. Her neediness grew sharper. She accused me of being distant, of changing, of not being the same supportive friend I used to be. She said she missed our closeness. What she missed, I realized, wasn't me. It was access. Walking away from that friendship felt strangely lonely and deeply relieving at the same time. I grieved the version of connection I thought we had, the one where vulnerability was mutual and safe, but I also felt a quiet reclaiming of something important. My experiences were mine again. My pain wasn't a performance. My healing didn't belong to anyone else's narrative. I learned that empathy doesn't mean consumption, and closeness doesn't mean entitlement. Some people don't want to understand your pain. They want to wear it, because it earns them care they don't know how to ask for honestly. And while that realization hurt, it taught me something I won't forget. Not everyone who listens deserves to know your deepest stories, and protecting them isn't selfish. It's necessary. He said I was the only person he needed. At first, it sounded like devotion, the kind people romanticize in movies and songs. The idea that loving someone could be so complete it replaced everything else. He said it early, with a softness in his voice that made it feel intimate rather than alarming. I don't really need anyone else, he told me once, lying beside me in the dark. As long as I have you, I'm good. I remember feeling chosen, special in a way that felt rare. I didn't hear the warning hidden inside the words. Over time, I began to notice how literal he meant it. He didn't talk to his family much. There was always a reason. Old arguments, misunderstandings, emotional distance that he said couldn't be repaired. I believed him. Families are complicated. He had a few friends when we met, but one by one they faded out of his life. He'd describe conflicts where he felt misunderstood or betrayed, and I stood by him, trusting his version of events. When the friendships ended, he didn't seem devastated. He seemed relieved. People are exhausting, he'd say. You're the only one who really gets me. At first, that felt like closeness. But closeness started to turn into gravity. If I made plans without him, he didn't forbid it, but the disappointment lingered thickly in the air. He'd say he understood, that he wanted me to have my own life, but his tone never quite matched his words. When I came back from seeing friends, he'd ask a lot of questions, not accusingly, just enough to remind me that my absence had been felt. If I mentioned enjoying myself, he'd smile, but something in his expression tightened. Slowly, without any explicit agreement, my world began to shrink. I found myself choosing activities based on how they would affect him. I canceled plans because I didn't want to deal with the emotional aftermath. I brought him along even when I craved alone time, because leaving him behind felt cruel. He framed his dependence as love, and love is hard to argue with without feeling heartless. Every time I tried to assert independence, I was met with quiet hurt, not anger, not manipulation in the obvious sense, just sadness. And sadness is powerful. He talked often about how lonely he'd felt before me, how empty his life had been, how lost he was. He credited me with giving his life meaning, direction, stability. I didn't want to take that away from him. I didn't want to be the person who abandoned someone who had finally found peace. So I stayed. I reassured. I made myself smaller. The weight of it didn't hit me all at once. It settled gradually, like something you don't notice until you're carrying it everywhere. I became his sounding board, his comfort, his entertainment, his emotional anchor. When he had a bad day, I was expected to absorb it. When he felt anxious, I was the solution. When he felt lost, I was the map. There was no room for me to be unavailable, to be unsure, to need support without also providing it. What scared me most was how guilty I felt for wanting space. The idea of leaving crossed my mind long before I admitted it to myself. It arrived quietly as a question I pushed away. What would happen to him if I wasn't here? He talked about me like I was a lifeline, like losing me would mean losing everything. I worried about how he'd cope, whether he'd spiral, whether I'd be responsible for the damage. That fear kept me rooted long after love had started to feel like obligation. The moment clarity arrived wasn't during a fight. It was during a moment of honesty I hadn't planned. I told him I was feeling overwhelmed, that I needed more balance in my life, more space to exist as myself. His face fell in a way I'll never forget. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just said, "I don't know who I am without you." That sentence landed like a verdict. I realized then that staying wasn't kindness anymore. It was enabling a dynamic that was unhealthy for both of us. Love shouldn't require someone to disappear into you. It shouldn't demand exclusivity from the rest of the world. What he called devotion was actually fear, and what I'd mistaken for closeness was dependence. Leaving was terrifying. I felt like I was walking away from someone standing on a cliff, and that image haunted me for weeks. But I also knew that staying would mean continuing to carry a responsibility that was never meant to be mine. I couldn't be his entire world without losing my own. When I finally stepped back, the silence was unbearable at first. The guilt was loud. But slowly, something else emerged. Relief, space, breath. I reconnected with parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd neglected. I remembered what it felt like to choose, not just accommodate. I still care about him. I probably always will. But care isn't the same as obligation, and love isn't meant to replace a life. It's meant to exist within one. I learned that being someone's everything might feel powerful at first, but it's a fragile position to stand in. Because if you're the only thing holding someone up, you're also the only thing they'll fall on when you leave. And no matter how much you love someone, that's not a weight anyone should have to carry. He said the flirting didn't mean anything. I didn't discover it in a dramatic way. There was no single message that shattered everything. No explicit confession or undeniable proof that would have made the decision easy. It was a pattern, and patterns are harder to confront because they invite doubt. The first thing I noticed was how often his phone seemed to light up when he wasn't around, how quickly he'd turn the screen away when I walked into the room, how casually he'd say he was just scrolling while smiling at something I wasn't part of. I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to be the jealous girlfriend who read too much into nothing. It started with social media. Likes on photos that lingered too long, comments that felt unnecessary, intimate for someone in a relationship, fire emojis, inside jokes with women I'd never heard of. When I asked about it, he laughed and said I was overthinking. "It's just online," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be secure, confident, above suspicion. So I swallowed the discomfort and told myself trust meant letting go. But letting go didn't bring peace. It brought vigilance. I began noticing how often he framed my reactions as the problem. If I looked uncomfortable, he said I was projecting. If I asked a question, he said I was interrogating him. The issue was never the behavior itself, but my response to it. He positioned himself as open and honest, and me as sensitive and controlling. It was subtle, but effective. I started questioning my instincts, wondering if I was being unfair, if I was expecting too much. The moment everything shifted came late one night when he fell asleep before me, his phone still unlocked on the nightstand. I didn't plan to look. I really didn't. But the screen lit up with a notification from someone whose name I didn't recognize, and curiosity mixed with unease in a way I couldn't ignore. I told myself I'd just glance, just confirm there was nothing there so I could finally relax. What I found wasn't explicit, but it was unmistakable. Messages that danced just shy of a line he insisted he'd never cross. Compliments about appearances, teasing, familiarity that suggested emotional intimacy, not just casual conversation. The kind of exchanges that create a private space between two people, even if they never touch. He wasn't talking about me. He wasn't mentioning that he had a girlfriend. He was presenting himself as available, even if he never explicitly said so. My chest tightened in a way that felt physical, like my body understood the betrayal before my mind caught up. I scrolled further, hoping to find context that would make it all harmless. Instead, I found more of the same. Different names, similar tones. The common thread wasn't the women, it was him. He wasn't accidentally crossing boundaries. He was cultivating attention. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said, "I knew you'd take it this way." He told me it was meaningless, that he liked the validation, that it made him feel good but didn't change how he felt about me. He insisted he never planned to meet any of them, that it was just flirting, just words, just harmless interaction. He asked why I was making such a big deal out of something that wasn't physical. That question stayed with me longer than the messages themselves, because what he was really asking was why emotional fidelity mattered, why the space he was giving to other people felt like a loss to me, why I expected exclusivity not just in actions, but in intention. He framed my hurt as insecurity, my boundaries as control. He said if I trusted him, I wouldn't care. And part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was old-fashioned. Maybe I was rigid. Maybe I was trying to own something that couldn't be owned. But trust, I realized, isn't about ignoring behavior that hurts you. It's about knowing that your partner won't seek intimacy elsewhere when things feel dull or stressful or routine. It's about feeling chosen even when no one is watching. After that conversation, nothing felt the same. Every time he picked up his phone, I felt a flicker of doubt. Not because I wanted to monitor him, but because I no longer felt included in his inner world. There were parts of him I wasn't invited into, and that exclusion did something quiet but irreversible to my sense of safety. I didn't want to become someone who checked, who questioned, who doubted constantly, but staying meant accepting a definition of commitment that left me feeling replaceable. What hurt the most wasn't the flirting itself. It was how easily he dismissed my pain, how quickly he labeled it irrational, how unwilling he was to imagine fidelity as something broader than physical acts. He wanted the freedom of being desired without the responsibility of protecting the relationship. He wanted reassurance without restraint. Leaving wasn't about punishing him or proving a point. It was about honoring a boundary I'd been trying to articulate for too long. I didn't want a relationship where I had to negotiate for emotional exclusivity, where I had to convince someone that my discomfort was valid. I wanted to feel secure without needing constant reassurance. And that wasn't possible with someone who needed attention from everywhere else to feel whole. Walking away felt heavy and strange, like letting go of something that was never fully mine to begin with. But as the distance grew, so did a sense of clarity. I realized that loyalty isn't measured by what you don't do, but by what you choose to protect. And I wanted a partner who understood that without having to be taught. I didn't leave because he flirted. I left because he didn't see why it mattered. They said I changed. When I finally started saying no, I didn't wake up one day and decide to become a different person. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden shift in personality, no moment where I thought, from now on, I'll be difficult. The change was so gradual that I barely noticed it myself. It started with exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from doing too much in one day, but from doing too much for too long without ever stopping to ask whether you actually wanted to. For most of my life, I was the reliable one, the one who answered calls, filled in gaps, adjusted plans, made things work. In my family, that role came naturally. I was praised for being understanding, for being easygoing, for not making things complicated. I learned early that harmony was valued more than honesty, that being agreeable made life smoother for everyone else. So I became good at it, too good. Saying yes felt automatic. Yes, I can help. Yes, I'll figure it out. Yes, it's fine, even when it wasn't. The discomfort didn't show up as anger at first. It showed up as quiet resentment, as a constant low-level irritation I couldn't quite explain. I'd replay conversations in my head, thinking of things I wished I'd said but didn't. I'd feel drained after interactions that were supposed to be loving. I started noticing how often my needs were an afterthought, how rarely anyone checked whether I was okay before assuming I would be. The first time I said no, it was almost accidental. A small request came up, one I would normally agree to without thinking. But that day, I felt stretched thin, emotionally and physically. I hesitated, then said I couldn't. I offered a brief explanation, nothing dramatic. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Someone laughed awkwardly and said, "That's not like you." I smiled, unsure why my stomach felt tight. After that, it happened more often. Not because I was trying to prove something, but because I was finally listening to myself. I declined invitations I didn't have the energy for. I set limits on conversations that always left me feeling small. I stopped volunteering for roles no one else wanted. Each no felt strange, unfamiliar, like trying on a version of myself I hadn't been allowed to wear before. And people noticed. At first, they framed it as concern. They asked if I was okay, if something was wrong, if I was stressed. I appreciated the care, even though it was new. But when the behavior continued, the concern shifted. I started hearing comments about how I'd changed, how I seemed distant, how I wasn't as warm as I used to be. Some said it jokingly. Others said it with disappointment they didn't bother hiding. What hurt wasn't the observation. It was the implication. The version of me they missed was the one who didn't push back, the one who absorbed inconvenience, the one who made their lives easier. When I tried to explain that I was just trying to be more honest, the explanations didn't land. They said things like, "We're family, you shouldn't need boundaries," or "You're overthinking it," or "Why are you making things so serious?" It felt like any attempt to advocate for myself was interpreted as rejection, even when I was still showing up, still caring, just differently. The hardest part was how often I questioned myself. When enough people tell you you've changed, you start wondering whether that change is a loss. I worried that I was becoming colder, less generous, less loving. I replayed old interactions, comparing them to new ones, trying to locate the exact moment where I'd crossed some invisible line. But then I noticed something else. The people who struggled most with my boundaries were the same people who benefited most from my lack of them. The ones who never asked how I was before asking what I could do. The ones who were uncomfortable when the dynamic shifted, when I stopped being endlessly available. Their disappointment wasn't about losing connection, it was about losing access. That realization was sobering. I started paying attention to who adjusted and who resisted. Some people listened, they asked questions, they respected my no even when it surprised them. Others pushed harder, framing my boundaries as selfishness, as withdrawal, as a personal slight. A few relationships grew quieter, more distant, not because I left, but because I was no longer filling a role they relied on. There was grief in that. I missed the ease of being liked without friction. I missed the certainty of belonging that came from being predictable. But I also felt something new beneath the sadness, relief. I wasn't constantly negotiating my needs anymore. I wasn't apologizing for existing in a way that took up space. What surprised me most was how much energy I gained. The time and emotional bandwidth I'd spent managing other people's expectations slowly returned to me. I had room to think, to rest, to feel without immediately translating those feelings into action for someone else's benefit. I started recognizing myself again, not as a role, but as a person. I still love my family. That hasn't changed. I still care deeply about the people in my life, but I no longer confuse love with self-sacrifice. I've learned that being kind doesn't require being compliant, that connection doesn't have to mean constant availability. Change can feel threatening to those who are comfortable with your silence. If they say, "I've changed," maybe they're right. I have. I changed in the direction of myself, and while that shift cost me some ease, some approval, some familiar dynamics, it gave me something far more valuable in return: the ability to exist without shrinking. I didn't become someone else. I became someone whole. I stayed, because it was easier than starting over. No one ever tells you how quiet the moment is when you realize you're unhappy. It's not dramatic. There's no explosion, no argument that finally crosses a line, no single betrayal that gives you permission to leave. It's just a slow awareness that settles into your chest one ordinary day and refuses to leave. That was how it happened for me. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling on my phone, half listening to the sound of someone I loved moving around the apartment, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a dull, persistent emptiness that made everything feel heavier than it needed to be. From the outside, my life looked fine, stable even. A long-term relationship, shared routines, inside jokes that still worked well enough, photos that made sense when posted online. People asked when we'd take the next step, when we'd move somewhere bigger, when we'd finally make it official in whatever way they expected. I smiled through those conversations because smiling was easier than explaining a truth I didn't fully understand myself. We didn't fight much. That was always the selling point, the reason I used to justify staying. At least it's peaceful, I'd say, as if peace were the same thing as happiness. Our days were predictable. We knew each other's schedules, coffee orders, bad moods. We existed side by side, competent at sharing space, bills, responsibilities. It worked in the way a system works when no one asks whether it's still serving its purpose. The problem was that something essential was missing, and I couldn't name it without feeling ungrateful. How do you admit that nothing is technically wrong, yet everything feels off? How do you tell someone who hasn't hurt you that you feel unseen, not because they ignore you, but because they don't really look anymore? I told myself stories to make it bearable. I said this was just what long relationships became. That passion faded and was replaced by comfort. That longing was something immature people chased. I convinced myself that wanting more depth, more curiosity, more emotional presence was unrealistic. Whenever the thought of leaving crossed my mind, it was quickly followed by a wave of fear. Not fear of losing them exactly, but fear of losing the structure of my life. Starting over sounded exhausting. The idea of dating again, of explaining myself to strangers, of risking disappointment all over felt overwhelming. There was also the weight of time invested. Years don't disappear just because you stop wanting what you built during them. I worried about being judged, about people saying I'd thrown away something good for vague reasons that didn't justify the disruption. So I stayed. I stayed through the growing distance, through the moments where conversations felt like checklists rather than connections. I stayed when I stopped sharing my inner thoughts because it felt easier to keep them to myself than to explain why they mattered. I stayed when I noticed how often I felt lonely despite never being alone. Sometimes I'd imagine what my life might look like if I left. The image was always blurry, undefined. That uncertainty scared me more than the familiarity of dissatisfaction. At least here, I knew what each day would look like. At least here, nothing surprised me. But there's a cost to staying where you no longer belong. It shows up subtly, in the way you stop dreaming out loud, in the way your body tenses when someone asks if you're happy, in the quiet resentment you feel toward yourself for choosing comfort over honesty. I became less expressive, more muted. Friends noticed, even if they didn't say it directly. I laughed less freely. I answered questions with vague half-truths. The breaking point wasn't a fight. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a moment of clarity that came unexpectedly. We were at a small gathering, surrounded by people talking excitedly about their plans, their projects, their futures. I listened, nodding along, and realized I couldn't picture my own future without feeling trapped. Not because of them specifically, but because of the version of myself I had become by staying. I had shrunk my world to fit the relationship, instead of letting the relationship expand my world. That night, lying awake beside someone who knew my habits but not my fears anymore, I understood that staying was no longer the neutral choice I'd pretended it was. It was an active decision to abandon parts of myself. Leaving would hurt. Yes, it would be messy, uncomfortable, full of uncertainty. But staying was slowly hollowing me out, and that felt like a quieter, more permanent kind of damage. I didn't leave the next day, or the next week. Realizations don't immediately turn into action, but something shifted. I stopped lying to myself about why I was there. I started paying attention to how often I chose silence over truth, ease over fulfillment. The idea of starting over didn't suddenly become less scary, but it became less frightening than the thought of waking up years later in the same place, having ignored every signal my own life was giving me. Eventually, when I did leave, people asked why. I didn't have a neat answer. I couldn't point to a single incident or flaw. All I could say was that staying had become harder than going, that I needed to find out who I was without constantly choosing what was easiest. It turns out that starting over isn't the end of the world. It's uncomfortable, yes, lonely at times, but it's also alive in a way staying never was. And for the first time in a long while, my life feels like something I'm actively participating in, not just managing. Everyone thought I was thriving, but I was just performing. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being applauded while slowly falling apart. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It hides behind compliments, behind encouragement, behind the way people look at you with admiration and say things like, "You're doing amazing," or "I wish I had it as together as you do." For a long time, I believed those words myself, or at least I tried to, because believing them was easier than admitting that my life had become a performance I no longer knew how to step out of. I became good at appearing successful, not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, respectable sense that people value. I met deadlines. I showed up early. I answered messages promptly. I kept my apartment clean enough to suggest stability, and my calendar full enough to imply purpose. On social media, I shared carefully curated glimpses of productivity and small joys, photos that suggested momentum, captions that sounded grounded and confident. If you looked at my life from the outside, you would have seen progress, forward motion, growth. Inside, it felt like I was running on a script written years ago and never revised. The performance began subtly. At first, it was just me trying to live up to expectations, my own and everyone else's. I wanted to make the most of opportunities, to prove that I was capable, reliable, deserving of the trust people placed in me. When I received praise, I felt relief more than pride. Relief that I hadn't disappointed anyone yet. Relief that I was still passing whatever invisible test I believed I was constantly taking. Over time, that relief turned into pressure. The version of me people admired started to feel rigid, demanding. There was no room for uncertainty in it, no allowance for rest or confusion. I felt like I had to maintain momentum at all costs because slowing down might reveal how little of this life actually felt like mine. So I kept going. I added responsibilities instead of subtracting them. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I said, "I'm just tired," when the truth was far more complicated. What made it harder was how convincing I was, even to myself. I'd catch glimpses of the truth in quiet moments, late at night when the noise of the day finally faded. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart racing for no clear reason, mind replaying conversations and tasks I hadn't even started yet. The thought that kept returning, unwanted and persistent, was simple and terrifying. If I stop, everything falls apart. Not because the world would collapse, but because I didn't know who I was without the constant doing. People came to rely on me. That was part of the trap. Being needed feels validating, especially when you're unsure of your own worth. I became the go-to person, the one who could be counted on, the one who never seemed overwhelmed. When someone asked how I managed it all, I laughed it off. I said things like, "You just get used to it," or "I like staying busy." What I didn't say was that staying busy kept me from feeling anything too deeply. There were warning signs I ignored. The way I felt numb during moments that should have excited me. The way weekends felt less like rest and more like preparation for the next stretch of endurance. The way my body held tension even when nothing was immediately wrong. I told myself this was normal, that everyone felt this way, that adulthood was just learning how to function while quietly exhausted. The idea of admitting otherwise felt dangerous. If I acknowledged how unhappy I was, I'd have to confront questions I didn't have answers to. Questions about whether I was on the right path, whether the goals I was chasing actually mattered to me, whether the life I was building was sustainable. It seemed easier to keep performing, to stay impressive, than to risk being honest and disappointing. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic collapse. It came in a moment of unexpected honesty from someone else. A friend, someone I admired for their openness, casually mentioned feeling lost, despite outward success. They spoke without shame, without apology. As I listened, something in me cracked. I realized how rarely I allowed myself that kind of truth, how tightly I'd been holding on to an image instead of a life. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety this time, but from a strange clarity. I understood that thriving isn't the same as being busy, that accomplishment without alignment eventually becomes hollow. I saw how much energy I'd spent convincing others I was okay, when what I really needed was to check in with myself. Letting go of the performance wasn't immediate. It wasn't even intentional at first. I started small. I said no to things I didn't have the capacity for, even when I worried about how it would look. I admitted uncertainty when asked about my plans instead of defaulting to confident answers. I stopped filling every empty space with productivity. Each choice felt uncomfortable, like stepping off a stage into silence. Some people were surprised. A few were disappointed. Without the constant output, the constant reassurance, the version of me they admired became quieter, less impressive. But something else happened too. I began to feel present in my own life again. Not always happy, not suddenly fulfilled, but real. My emotions returned in full color, messy and unfiltered. I remembered what it felt like to want something for myself, not because it looked good, but because it felt right. The performance had protected me for a while. It had given me structure, validation, a sense of direction when I didn't know how to create one internally. But it had also cost me my voice, my intuition, my ability to rest without guilt. Stepping away from it felt like failure at first, like I was undoing everything I'd worked for. Over time, I realized it was the opposite. I wasn't falling apart. I was finally stopping long enough to notice where I'd been going. Now, when people tell me I seem different, I don't rush to correct them. They're right. I am. I'm less polished, less constantly impressive, but I'm also more honest, more grounded, more connected to the life I'm actually living instead of the one I was trying to sell. Thriving, I've learned, isn't about being admired. It's about being able to exist without pretending, even when no one is watching. I didn't realize I was afraid of being alone until I finally was. For a long time, I thought I stayed in relationships because I loved deeply. That's the story I told myself, and it sounded good enough that I didn't question it. I believed I was loyal, patient, willing to work through discomfort. I prided myself on not giving up easily, on seeing people through their rough edges. It wasn't until everything went quiet that I understood a harder truth. I wasn't staying because I loved them. I was staying because the idea of being alone scared me more than being unhappy. I didn't grow up feeling particularly abandoned, at least not in ways that looked obvious. My life was stable on paper. I had people around, friends, partners, routines. I was rarely physically alone, and I mistook that for emotional security. Whenever a relationship ended, I rushed into the next one with a sense of urgency I disguised as coincidence. Timing just worked out, I told myself. I met someone new quickly. I connected easily. I didn't linger in the in-between. The in-between terrified me. Being single felt like standing in an empty room with no distractions. There was nothing to hide behind, no shared plans to lean on, no one else's presence to define the shape of my days. Even when relationships drained me, they gave me structure. They gave me identity. I was someone's partner, someone's priority, someone's constant. Alone, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be, so I tolerated things I shouldn't have. I explained away emotional distance, mismatched values, conversations that never went deep enough. I told myself every relationship required compromise, that no one was perfect, that wanting more was unrealistic. In reality, I was afraid that if I let go, there would be nothing waiting for me on the other side except silence. The pattern repeated itself until it became impossible to ignore. I'd stay longer than I should, feel increasingly disconnected, then leave only when the discomfort outweighed the fear. And even then, I'd soften the ending, stay friends longer than necessary, keep emotional doors cracked open just enough to avoid feeling completely untethered. I never let the ground fully disappear beneath my feet. The moment everything changed wasn't dramatic. It came after a breakup that was quiet and mutual, the kind that leaves no villain to point at. We both knew it wasn't working anymore, and we said all the right things. We wished each other well. We meant it. When it ended, there was no anger to distract me, no chaos to manage, just space. And for the first time in years, I didn't fill it. I told myself I'd take a break. Just a few months, no dating apps, no situationships, no leaning on someone else's attention to prop me up. At first, it felt manageable, almost refreshing. I rearranged my apartment, leaned into routines, caught up with friends. I enjoyed the novelty of not negotiating my time with anyone else. Then, the quiet set in. Evenings stretched longer than I expected. Weekends felt unstructured in a way that made me restless. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, half expecting a message that wasn't coming. Without realizing it, I had used relationships as background noise, something to keep me from hearing my own thoughts too clearly. Now, there was nothing buffering me from myself. That's when the fear surfaced. It showed up as anxiety, as an urge to download dating apps just to look, as fantasies about running into someone familiar who might pull me back into a dynamic I already understood. My mind kept offering escape routes. You don't have to feel this. You could be talking to someone right now. The temptation wasn't about connection, it was about avoidance. I started noticing how uncomfortable I was with my own presence, how quickly boredom turned into unease, how silence felt less like peace and more like exposure. Without someone else to mirror me back to myself, I felt unanchored. It was unsettling to realize how much of my sense of self had been built in relation to others. But staying with that discomfort did something unexpected. Slowly, I began to hear things I'd been drowning out. Desires that didn't fit neatly into a shared life. Opinions I'd softened to keep the peace. Grief I hadn't processed because there was always someone else's needs to attend to. Being alone didn't create these feelings. It revealed them. I learned how to sit with evenings that didn't need to be productive or shared. I learned how to make decisions without consulting anyone else, not out of defiance, but out of curiosity. I learned that loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. Even though they're often mistaken for each other, loneliness feels like lack. Solitude feels like presence. It took time to feel the difference. There were still moments of doubt, nights when the quiet felt heavy again, when I wondered if I was being stubborn or romanticizing independence. But each time I resisted the urge to fill the space prematurely, I felt a little more grounded. I began to trust that I could hold my own life without immediately handing it over to someone else. What surprised me most was how my standards shifted. Without the fear of being alone driving my choices, I could see past the comfort of familiarity. I no longer felt tempted by connections that offered attention without depth, closeness without understanding. The idea of entering another relationship started to feel less urgent and more intentional. I wasn't looking for someone to rescue me from myself anymore. Being alone didn't magically solve everything. It didn't turn me into some perfectly self-sufficient person who never wanted companionship again. I still value connection. I still want love. But now, I want it as an addition, not a solution. I want it because it enhances my life, not because it shields me from facing it. I didn't realize how afraid I was of being alone until I finally allowed myself to be. And in that fear, I found something steady. Not certainty, not constant happiness, but a sense of self that doesn't disappear when no one else is there to witness it. And that, I've learned, is a foundation worth building on. I kept explaining myself until I forgot what I actually felt. I used to believe that if I could just find the right words, everything would make sense. That misunderstandings were temporary, that clarity was always one good conversation away, that if I explained myself calmly enough, carefully enough, the people I loved would finally see me. I didn't realize how much of my life would be spent translating my own feelings into something more palatable for others, sanding down the sharp edges of truth until it no longer cut anyone, especially me. It started innocently, a disagreement here, a hurt feeling there. I'd noticed tension and rushed to address it, not because I was confrontational, but because I hated the feeling of unresolved space between people. I'd rehearse conversations in my head, choosing words that sounded reasonable, empathetic, fair. I learned how to preface my feelings with disclaimers. I might be wrong. I don't want to make this a big deal. I know you didn't mean it. Each sentence felt like a peace offering, a way of making sure the other person didn't feel accused. At first, it seemed to work. Conflicts ended without shouting. People told me they appreciated how thoughtful I was, how easy it was to talk to me. I took pride in that. Being understood felt like proof that the effort was worth it. But slowly, the conversations started looping. The same issues resurfaced, just dressed in different details. I'd explain again, adjusting my language, trying a softer tone, a different angle, hoping this time it would land. What I didn't notice was how often those explanations turned into defenses. Instead of being heard, I was clarifying. Instead of expressing, I was justifying. My feelings became something I had to argue for, something that needed context and evidence before it could be taken seriously. If someone reacted badly, I assumed it was because I hadn't explained myself well enough yet. So I tried harder. I became more patient, more articulate, more careful. The cost of that effort showed up quietly. After arguments, I'd feel strangely empty, like something had been drained out of me. I knew what I'd said, but I wasn't always sure what I felt anymore. My emotions started to sound theoretical, like ideas I could discuss rather than experiences I was living. I'd talk about being hurt without actually touching the hurt. I'd describe disappointment without letting myself feel disappointed. I began to notice how often conversations ended with the other person feeling resolved while I felt unresolved. They'd say things like, "I get it now," or "Thanks for explaining," and I'd nod, relieved that the tension had eased, even though nothing had really changed. The behavior stayed the same. The pattern continued, and each time I'd step back into the role of translator, convinced that understanding was still just one explanation away. The turning point came during a conversation that should have been simple. I was trying to explain why something mattered to me, something small but meaningful. I spoke slowly, choosing my words with care, watching the other person's reactions, adjusting in real time. Halfway through my explanation, I stopped, not because they interrupted me, but because I realized I didn't know what I was trying to say anymore. I'd been explaining for so long that the original feeling had slipped out of reach. That moment scared me. I realized I'd been so focused on being understood that I'd stopped listening to myself. I was more concerned with making my emotions acceptable than with honoring them. I had trained myself to believe that if someone didn't get it, the problem was my communication, not their willingness to listen. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how often I took responsibility for other people's discomfort, how quickly I rushed to smooth things over, how rarely I allowed silence to exist after stating a boundary or a feeling. I noticed how much energy I spent explaining why I felt the way I felt, as if emotions needed permission to exist. I started experimenting with doing less, saying how I felt once, clearly, without cushioning it, not rushing to fill the silence if the response wasn't immediate, letting people sit with what I said instead of rescuing them from it. It felt uncomfortable, almost rude, like I was breaking some unspoken rule about being agreeable and accommodating. Some people adjusted. They asked questions. They leaned in. Others didn't. They grew defensive or dismissive, accused me of being distant or difficult. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain that reaction away. I let it stand as information. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt. Without the constant need to clarify, to convince, to translate, my emotions started to feel solid again. I could feel anger without immediately turning it into a lesson. I could feel sadness without packaging it into something easier to digest. I didn't need every feeling to be validated in order for it to be real. I learned that being understood is not the same as being heard, and being heard is not the same as being respected. Some people don't misunderstand you. They just don't like what you're saying, and no amount of explanation will change that. Now, when I speak, I try to notice whether I'm sharing or defending, whether I'm expressing or negotiating. If I feel the urge to keep explaining past the point of clarity, I pause and ask myself who I'm really trying to convince. Most of the time, the answer isn't them. I still value communication. I still believe in talking things through. But I no longer believe that my feelings need to be endlessly translated to be valid. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is say how you feel and stop talking. Let the truth stand on its own, even if it's uncomfortable, especially then. I thought loyalty meant enduring everything. For a long time, loyalty was the word I hid behind whenever something felt wrong. It sounded noble, solid, unquestionable. Loyalty meant staying when things got hard, giving people the benefit of the doubt, choosing commitment over comfort. I wore it like armor, convinced that endurance was proof of character, that walking away was a failure of resolve rather than a response to harm. I didn't question where I learned that belief, only how deeply it shaped my choices. I was proud of how much I could tolerate. I told myself that everyone had flaws, that relationships weren't supposed to be easy, that real bonds were forged through difficulty. When friends expressed concern, I brushed it off. They didn't see the whole picture, I said. They didn't understand the history, the context, the reasons. I believed that loving someone meant holding space for their worst moments, even if those moments became the rule rather than the exception. Over time, the line between patience and self-erasure blurred. I found myself explaining behavior I wouldn't accept from anyone else. I minimized my own reactions, reframed my discomfort as growth opportunities, turned pain into proof that I was trying hard enough. Every time I considered leaving, guilt rushed in. What kind of person abandons someone who's struggling? What kind of partner chooses their own peace over another person's needs? The truth I avoided was that loyalty had become a one-way street. I stayed through broken promises that were always accompanied by convincing explanations. I stayed through apologies that sounded sincere but led nowhere. I stayed through moments when my body tensed before conversations, when my chest tightened at the sound of a familiar tone, when I rehearsed neutrality so I wouldn't provoke conflict. I told myself this was what commitment looked like when it was tested. What I didn't notice at first was how much of myself I was losing in the process. My world grew smaller, not because anyone explicitly demanded it, but because I was constantly managing fallout. I avoided topics that might trigger defensiveness. I filtered my emotions before speaking. I stopped expecting change and started focusing on adaptation. Loyalty, I believed, meant adjusting until things worked. The breaking point didn't come from something dramatic. It came from exhaustion so deep it felt like numbness. One evening, after yet another conversation where nothing shifted, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized myself. I looked tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. There was a hollowness behind my eyes, a quiet resignation that scared me more than anger ever had. That was when a different question surfaced, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. Who is this loyalty actually serving? I realized that my commitment had stopped being about love and started being about fear. Fear of being seen as selfish, fear of wasting time, fear of having to rebuild a life I'd organized around someone else. Loyalty felt safer than uncertainty, even when it came at the cost of my well-being. Once that thought took root, everything shifted. I started noticing how often my needs were postponed indefinitely, how rarely accountability followed harm, how loyalty was expected from me but framed as optional for them. I saw how endurance had become my identity, how being the one who stays had replaced being the one who felt alive. Leaving felt like betrayal at first. Not of them, but of the version of myself I'd built around the idea of unwavering commitment. I worried about who I'd be without that role, without the moral high ground of perseverance. But staying, I finally understood, wasn't virtuous anymore. It was just familiar. When I did walk away, the world didn't collapse the way I'd imagined. It hurt deeply. There was grief, doubt, loneliness, but there was also a strange lightness, a sense of returning to myself piece by piece. I noticed how my body relaxed in ordinary moments, how my thoughts felt clearer without constant vigilance, how my energy slowly came back when it wasn't being spent on survival. I learned that loyalty without reciprocity isn't strength, it's self-neglect. That commitment doesn't require you to absorb endless harm. That staying isn't inherently more honorable than leaving. Sometimes the bravest, most loyal thing you can do is be loyal to yourself, especially when you've spent years proving you could endure anything. I still value loyalty. I just understand it differently now. It isn't about how much pain you can withstand or how long you can wait for someone to change. It's about mutual care, shared responsibility, and the willingness to protect each other's dignity. Anything less isn't loyalty. It's just endurance dressed up as virtue.